Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
The idea that someone could kill other people for mere pleasure may seem sickening to us, but when these types of crimes are committed by a little kid is even more macabre and difficult to understand. That is why the social and moral debate that the case of Mary Flora Bell involved highlighted the poor living conditions of some children in England during the 1960s. To this day, she is still considered one of the youngest murderers in true crime. The city of Newcastle, in England, during the 1960s had two completely different faces. On one hand, it was a metropolis with growing development and with a rich cultural heritage. Another sector of the citizenry, however, struggled with poverty and unemployment, produced in part by the aftermath of the post-war period. The Scotswood area was one of the most affected, and its inhabitants lived among ruined buildings and forgotten air raid shelters. This extensive area of rubble was known as the Rat Alley. There were no parks in the surrounding area, so the children used to visit it and play there all day long, without the supervision of their parent. However, some warned that at any moment a misfortune could happen. The site was prone to landslides, and there were all kinds of dangerous objects, such as broken glass and sharp metals scattered around the place. Finally, something horrible happened in the Rat Alley, although it was not due to an accident. On Saturday, May 25, 1968, around 3 p.m., a group of boys alerted some workers about a terrible discovery. The body of a 4-year-old child, identified as Martin Braun, was lying on the floor of an abandoned house. The body showed no signs of violence, and a bottle of pills was found next to it, which led the police to assume that the minor had ingested them. The residents of Scotswood were very affected by the news, and hundreds gathered in front of the house when they removed the child's body. The government had committed years before to remove the rubble area and rebuild it, but its progress had been practically nil. The neighbors organized and carried out a march, with banners and scribbled sheets to protest the situation, asking for better housing and safe play areas for their children. One of the girls who led the march, banner in hand, was Mary Bell, a little girl who lived in the same neighborhood. Martin Brown's parents were extremely sorry for having neglected their little boy. The child had wandered away from home and ended up in the Rat Alley, where he had died under suspicious circumstances. One day before the funeral, Mary Bell knocked on the door of the Brown house. The girl asked Martin's mother if she could see Martin. The distraught woman explained that it was not possible, because he had gone to heaven. To his surprise, Mary told her that she knew the boy was dead, and that she wanted to see him inside the coffin. Martin's mother was outraged by the uncomfortable situation and slammed the door on her. Never it crossed his mind that she was face to face with his son's murderer. One day after Martin Brown's death, the police received a call from the town daycare center. The staff had complained several times about acts of vandalism and petty thefts committed by strangers. This time, however, it was different. Someone had entered the premises during the night and had left letters in which they claimed the murder of Martin Brown and threatened to kill again. The agents assumed that it was a twisted joke, and did not investigate further. A couple of days after the incident, 2 girls were discovered snooping around inside the daycare. Their names were Mary and Norma Bell, who, despite sharing a last name, were not related. They were reprimanded by the police, although no charges were filed. On July 31st of that same year, the long-awaited summer vacation had finally arrived. Hundreds of children went directly to the Rat Alley to spend time observing the demolitions of the old buildings or playing hide and seek, despite the warnings of their parents. As evening fell, the family of Brian Howe, a child of only 3 years old, reported his disappearance to the local authorities. Hundreds of people joined the search, which would culminate shortly after 11 p.m., when the miner's body was found behind a pile of bricks and other debris in a vacant area. This time, it was evident that it was a murder, but with characteristics as perverse as unusual. The pathologist who performed the autopsy ruled that the miner had died of strangulation. It also showed several cuts made post-mortem, possibly with a razor blade. Also had several wounds on his thighs, and they had also tried to amputate his penis. In the miner's abdomen, the murderer had covered a letter N with some scissors that were found at the scene, but then he corrected it and transformed it into a letter M. Also discovered that some strands of the kid's hair had been cut off. The specialist warned that he believed that the murder had been committed by a minor because the wounds were quite superficial and showed that the perpetrator of the crime did not have much strength. That report was enough for several agents to suspect that the death of Brian Howe could be linked to that of Martin Brown, the boy who had been found dead in the house just a month before. The police interrogations focused on the miners in the neighborhood before the horrified eyes of the Scotswood families, as it is inconceivable to them to think that a miner was behind these macabre murders. Still, the police were already quite sure, and they decided to the task of interviewing more than 1,000 children. Days later, Brian Howe's parents notified the police that 2 girls from the neighborhood had been harassing them with uncomfortable questions about their son's death. The minors, identified as Mary and Norma Bell, asked them in mockery if they missed him, then started laughing maliciously. Pat, one of the victim's sisters, remembered having been looking for Brian on the day of the discovery, when she ran into Mary Bell, who told her that perhaps the boy was behind some rubble near an abandoned industrial area where some children used to play. Pat ignored the girl's recommendation, since her brother never ventured into that area. Hours later, his body had been found precisely in that place. After being questioned by the police, it was evident that they were hiding something. Norma Bell appeared emotional and maintained a childish behavior during the interviews, as if she were taking it as a joke. Mary Bell was evasive when asked questions. Both girls could not agree on their versions, and they changed them constantly. The police began to focus their interest on Mary and Norma Bell, gathering information that seemed to accelerate the course of the investigation. The school teachers and her classmates declared that both girls were acting very strangely. They were quieter than usual, although Mary had not been shy about boasting in front of her classmates about an alleged crime that she had committed. According to her own words, she claimed to have strangled a child. But as expected, no one had believed her. On May 11th of that same year, and only a couple of weeks before the lifeless body of Martin Brown appeared in the abandoned house, Mary and Norma had been involved in a problem with the authorities. The girls had been seen in the company of a 3-year-old minor, who was later found wandering the street alone, bleeding from the head and dizzy. Although the police got involved, they assumed that it had been a simple accident. The next day, May 12th, Mary and Norma attacked Pauline Watson, a 7-year-old girl. Norma immobilized her while Mary tried to strangle her while filling her mouth with sand. Pauline's mother notified the authorities, but again they decided not to intervene, thinking that it was just a girls' fight. Even before Mary and Norma met and began attacking other children, Mary Bell already had a bad reputation. She had attacked other minors and had even burned one with a cigarette at school. and practically all the boys avoided her. The investigators sensed that Mary was not going to cooperate, so they decided to insist on Norma until she finally confessed. In her words, Mary murdered Brian alone and then took her to the place where the body was and confessed what she had done. Wring their neck and crush their lungs. That's how you kill them. The police immediately went to Mary Bell's home and questioned her for several hours, but she denied all the accusations with disconcerting calm. The next day, one of the officers who questioned her saw her standing in front of the Howe's house. While the miner's funeral will take place inside, the girl's face was one of fascination, satisfaction, and morbidity. At that same moment, the officer decided that Mary and Norma should be arrested. Detective Dobson, the one who arrested Mary, declared on an interview a few years later, Mary Bell was standing in front of the Howe's house when the coffin was brought out. I was, of course, watching her, and it was when I saw her there that I knew I did not dare risk another day. She stood there, laughing and rubbing her hands. I thought, my God, I have got to bring her in. She'll do another one. The first night in their small jail cells in Newcastle West End Police Station, the girls were restless. They kept shouting to each other through the doors, said one of the policewomen who watched the children. The police station was not accustomed to housing child offenders, and they had to make provisions as best as they could. We finally told them to shut up. At one moment I heard Mary shout out angrily about her mother. Mary, who had been a chronic bedwetter, was terrified of going to sleep, for fear that she might mess her bed. I usually do, she confided. At home, Mary's mother severely humiliated her whenever she wet the bed, rubbing her daughter's face in the pool of urine, said Mary, years later. She then hung the mattress outside for the entire neighborhood to see. During the course of her incarceration, the women guards got to know Mary better, describing her as confident, intelligent, and cheeky. Some of Mary's casual comments would shock the police women, but others saw her as a scared little girl who had no comprehension of the enormity of her actions. In the middle of the night, Mary would bolt upright. Mary's hostility had an almost naive quality, while tightly grabbing a stray cat by the neck. A guard told her not to hurt the cat. Mary allegedly replied, "Oh, she doesn't feel that, and anyway, I like hurting little things that can't fight back." In another incident, a policewoman said that Mary said she'd like to be a nurse because then I can stick needles into people. I like hurting people. After collecting all the information, it was decided to accuse both minors of the murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe. The psychiatrist, Dr. David Westbury, had the opportunity to interrogate both girls. While Norma appeared to be an immature, very nervous, and low intellectual girl, Mary Bell turned out to be the complete opposite. She was an extremely intelligent, cold, and manipulative girl. She managed to divert the focus of the interviews with remarkable skill, considering her young age. Although the evidence had accumulated against her, she seemed to have extreme self-control. The psychiatric analysts concluded that she was a psychopathic girl. The unusual trial against Mary and Norma Bell began on December 5, 1968, and shocked the country. The population was expectant, faced with one of the most surprising cases in its history. Two minors, aged 11 and 13 respectively, were suspected of having committed two horrific crimes in an unusual criminal association. Faced with public scrutiny and the jury, Norma broke on several occasions, claimed to be innocent, and blamed both murders on her friend. Mary appeared unwavering, with a confident voice, and with coherent arguments, she blamed Norma for the crimes and denied all the accusation. However, the psychiatric examinations that assured that Mary was a psychopath, manipulative, and dangerous had a significant impact on the jury. Her responses were always astute and sharp. She never started to cry or looked nervous because of the stressful situation she was in, nor did she show remorse. one of Mary's teachers, shocked by the case, decided to review some of the notebooks that the girl had left at school, coming across a macabre surprise. In one of them, she had drawn the corpse of a child next to a bottle of pills. This drawing alluded to the death of Martin Brown, and very few of those involved in the case knew about the discovery of the bottle at the scene of the crime. Only someone who had been there could know. This would be one of the most important evidence in the case, and which ended up incriminating Mary Bell. On December 17th, considering Mary's age, she was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter for reasons of diminished responsibility and sentenced to be imprisoned for an indefinite period. Norma was acquitted, as it was considered that she was manipulated by Mary and acted under duress. The controversy would begin practically on day one, because given the unusual case, it had not been thought about where Mary Bell would spend her first night in prison. Considering that she was only 11 years old, the system had the obligation to imprison her, but where? Initially, she was placed in a place of preventive detention. A year later, she was transferred to the special unit of Red Bank in St. Helens, Lancashire. Although it is assumed that a psychopathic person cannot be cured, the authorities were pressured in the case of Mary Bell. Leaving her locked up for life was not an option, but she could only be released if she was rehabilitated. Red Bank was a reform school, a portion of which was high security. By most accounts, the institution was a well-designed and reasonably comfortable facility, with a supportive staff headed by James Dixon, a former Navy man who was known for his strong moral influence. Mr. Dixon provided structure and discipline for Mary, and she came to respect and love him. If Mary had been in the stranglehold of an evil, immoral mother, Mr. Dixon filled the role of the benevolent, strong father figure which was lacking in her life. She loved Billy Bell, who was not her biological father, but was in her life from the beginning, but as a thief. He was not an ideal role model. When he was convicted of armed robbery in 1969, his visits to Mary ended. Mary's mother was a disciplinarian, but not the kind generally advocated for family situations. As a prostitute with a specialty, she disciplined her clients with whips and bondage, claimed Mary, but Betty Bell did make some provisions. "I always hid the whips from the kids," she said. Betty visited her daughter often, and Mary eagerly awaited opportunities to see her mother, but she always appeared disturbed afterward and acted out aggressively. According to the Red Bank staff, one doctor wanted Betty's visits to stop, but to suggest that a mother be kept from her daughter was unthinkable in that era. The staff at Red Bank hated the overly dramatic and manipulative Betty. "She played at being a mother," said one teacher. Betty Bell profited from her daughter's notoriety, selling her story to the tabloids, and encouraged her daughter to write letters and poems that could be easily peddled to the press. Betty wanted her daughter to see how much she suffered as the mother of a famous juvenile murderer. Said Mary, "Jesus was only nailed to the cross. I'm being hammered," complained Betty. The philosophy of Red Bank was to focus on the present. Dwelling on past experiences was detrimental, and therefore Mary Bell's upbringing and eventual murders were not adequately acknowledged. One psychiatrist thought Mary was blocking out her troubled past and was being discouraged from making any attempts to discover why she killed. "There is in her an extraordinary inner intensity. A neediness one can neither really understand nor handle," he said. "She went through many counselors, very few of which got to know her well. She was manipulative and picked fights with the boys, and claimed to have had a twin sister named Paula. I think I was inventing a twin who might have done what I really did," she said later. In 1970, Mary reported to a counselor she had been sexually assaulted by a housemaster, but her account was considered unreliable, although staff changes were made soon hereafter. Later, in 1972, she began provoking the boys and snuck into the boys' dormitory at night. Also, she wounded herself with self-inflicted cuts. In 1972, Mary's mother, Betty Bell, gave a television interview. She was addicted to drink and drugs, so she had begun to profit from her daughter's story, and the question of society in general was evident. What had happened for such a small girl to be capable of killing 2 other minors? Mary had committed the first murder, just 1 day before turning 11 years old, and the second almost a month later. In addition, she had manipulated another girl almost 3 years older than her at will to help her. Betty seemed to contribute little and nothing when it came to searching for a satisfactory explanation. She said that perhaps the arguments with her husband, a small-time criminal named Billy Bell, could have affected the girl's behavior.
Betty Bell herself gave a television interview in 1972, 4 years after the killings. She was by then a broken woman, relying on drink and drugs for peace of mind.
Now, Betty, are you saying that your daughter is innocent?
No, I'm not saying she's innocent.
But something must have made her do these things.
Yes, something possibly must have made her do these things.
What was it about her life and her family you think that could have driven her to these things?
Maybe it's the arguments between my husband and myself might have had some inflict on her. I don't know.
Have you been very despairing sometimes? And
Very despairing, very under a lot of strain, stress, and grief for my daughter.
At 16, she was moved to a prison, which was a traumatic experience not only for the confused and angry teenager, but for the staff as well, particularly Mr. Dixon. There can be little doubt that this transfer was destructive for Mary, wrote Sereny in Cries Unheard. Mary had to adjust from a mostly male atmosphere at Red Bank to a full women's facility at Style. She was a rebellious prisoner and was frequently punished, but soon adapted. What I had to do was, yes, continue to fight the system. But I had to graduate from being a prisoner to being a con. And that meant that rather than being open and angry, I had to be closed and crafty. She also decided, in her words, to go butch. When her mother heard this, she said, "Jesus Christ, what next? You're a murderer and now you're a lesbian." A consultant child psychiatrist, who did weekly group therapy sessions at Style, observed that Mary went a long way toward persuading her world that she was masculine. She strutted, and made up as if she had stubble on her face, and rolled up stockings in the shape of male genitals and pointed this out to me in class. I think she wore these all the time. She would later ask a doctor for a sex change, but was denied. It was the idea of not being me, she said. The writer Gitta Sereny published a book titled The Case of Mary Bell, a portrait of a child who murdered, in 1972, where she recounts much of the trial that shook England in the 1960s. In 1998, she wrote a second book about the case, in which the true and terrible story of Mary Bell would be revealed, and again, a great controversy would arise about it. According to the text, Mary's mother, Betty Bell, was an unstable woman who became addicted to drugs as a teenager. At the age of 16, she became pregnant with Mary, although it was never known who the father was. The girl was born on May 26, 1957, and from the beginning, Betty saw her as a nuisance. Her reaction when the nurse handed her the newborn proves it. She simply told her coldly, "Take that thing away from me." Shortly after settling in Scotswood, she met a robber named Billy Bell, with whom she was absent for weeks, leaving little Mary in the care of neighbors and relatives. She even tried to give her up for adoption in those years, but she was unsuccessful. The desperation to get rid of her daughter was so great that she tried to kill her on several occasions, giving her herbs and drugs in her meals. Little Mary suffered from several overdoses, for which she had to be admitted to the hospital several times to be treated. They will perform stomach pumps. She was also malnourished, as the woman rarely fed her, and on one occasion, the minor fell from a window, although apparently without causing serious injuries. Betty, in addition to taking drugs and drinking excessively, began to prostitute herself to finance her lifestyle. When Mary was 4 years old, her mother decided to offer her to the men who slept with her, to add some extra money. At first, she forced her to offer oral sex to his clients, but later, Betty auctioned her daughter's virginity in exchange for a large sum of money, so Mary, at only 8 years old, would lose her virginity at the hands of a pedophile that his mother contacted. From then on, she would offer her to all of her clients. Thanks to this, and added to the physical and psychological abuse by her mother, the girl acted coldly and violently with her surroundings, hitting her schoolmates, threatening them, lying compulsively, was manipulative, and was also cruel to animals, whom she tortured without flinching. Even on one occasion, she tried to burn down her own house. It is during this period that she meets Norma Bell, and they commit the murders. Mary Bell's crimes do not have a justification, although perhaps there is an explanation. In just 11 years of life, she went through a true hell, where several negative factors were added. She lacked family affection. She had an abusive mother, who in addition, she consumed alcohol and drugs during pregnancy, suffered from poor nutrition, which can lead to malnutrition as well as psychological disorders, and there could even have been brain damage due to the overdose of drugs supplied by Betty for years. All of this may affect her enough to transform her into a cold and calculating killer, and perhaps this would make her fit more into the profile of a sociopath, and not a psychopath. Mary Bell never mentioned these abuses. As usually happens in this type of case, where the victims are children, it is likely that she felt hatred towards her mother, but also terror, and preferred to remain silent. In 1972, when Mary Bell was in jail, received several visits from her mother. Some journalists claimed to have seen Betty with photos of the girl in her underwear, and in explicit poses. These photographs had been taken by her own mother, in order to market them. Apparently, even while behind bars, she continued to sexually exploit her. It was very likely that some men were eager to buy said material. She also asked her to write poems or thoughts during her visits, which she later sold to reporters, collectors of objects related to crimes, or simply morbid people. After being transferred to a less secure facility in 1977, Mary escaped, was picked up, along with a fellow escapee, by 2 young men. In her brief time out, Mary slept with 2 boys. The boys later sold their story to the tabloids and claimed she escaped from jail so she could get pregnant. As time went on, my nightmare was the press, said Mary. I never could understand what they wanted from me. On May 14, 1980, at the age of 23, Mary Bell was released. According to specialists, she no longer represented a risk to society, and her rehabilitation process had been successful. But skepticism reigned throughout England. Was she really cured? Mary was moved to a hostel a few months before her parole in 1980, and she met a married man who got her pregnant. He said he was determined to show me I wasn't a lesbian, she said. It was hard for me not to think of sex as dirty. When she found out she was with child, she had a moral crisis of sorts. But if I think that almost the first thing I did after 12 years in prison for killing 2 babes was to kill the baby in me. Mary felt she had no choice. There was great concern over whether the woman who had murdered 2 children should be able to become a mother herself. Yet she fought for the right to keep her child, which was born in 1984. Mary lived for a few years in Suffolk, and her first job was in the local children's nursery. But the probation officers deemed this inappropriate work for her. She took waitress jobs and attended a university, but was too discouraged to stick with it. Since his true identity was barely discovered, she had to leave due to social pressure and threats. She eventually met a man and fell in love, then settled in a small town. But the probation officer had to inform the local authorities of her presence. and soon the villagers were marching through the street with "Murderer out" signs. She lived in constant fear of being exposed. Around that time, Mary claimed to have a new awareness of her crimes from the birth of her child. "If there was something wrong with me when I was a child, there wasn't now. I felt that if they could X-ray me inside, they could see that anything broken had been fixed," she insisted. Even so, the press harassed her for months, while she tried in vain to maintain her privacy, since the same police continued to monitor her every move. On May 21, 2003, the Mary Bell Law was created in England, which undertakes to protect the identity of any minor who has been involved in legal proceedings. They get the right to live anonymously for the rest of their lives. In this way, Mary was able to obtain a new identity, and to today her whereabouts are unknown. The last thing that was known about the murderous girl was that she had become a grandmother at 51, and that her mother had died. Apparently, they continued to visit each other from time to time. When Cries Unheard, the second book, was published in 1998, it ignited a firestorm over criminals profiting from their deeds. Mary was paid for her efforts, which infuriated so many that Prime Minister Tony Blair publicly decried her pay. Mary Bell received more than $60,000 for the publication of the book that revealed his past. After that, laws were written to prevent others, including serial killer Dennis Nilsen, from doing the same. Mary's hope for the book was to set the record straight. She thought that if she told her story, the media would leave her alone. Sereny, however, says the book was written for the benefit of Mary's child. Yet she too was damaged by its publication. With the renewed media interest in Mary, reporters laid siege on her house. Her teenage daughter learned her mother was the infamous Mary Bell as the family evacuated their home, with blankets over their heads, dodging the flash bulbs and shouts from the media. But Mary says her daughter has accepted her mother's identity and forgives her. "But Mum, why didn't you tell me? You were just a kid, younger than I am now," she said. According to Mary, the relatives of the victims, for their part, faced their own ordeal. Immersed in the pain of loss and harassed by the media morbidity, they felt disconcerted by the murders of their children, since the author of the crimes was just a girl. How could you react to it? The Chronicle published in 2018 part of an interview with the sister of Mary Bell's first victim, Martin Brown. In it, Sharon Richardson comments that her childhood was very dark and depressive. She was born years after the murder of her brother, and her family was still traumatized by the crime that changed their lives. As a child, she did not understand why her parents were so silent, and sometimes they burst into tears. This whole depressive atmosphere affected her. She and her sister knew that their brother died in tragic circumstances, but it was not until 1998, and after the scandal generated by Gitta Sereny's book, that they learned of the horrible details of his death. Only then would the family speak openly about the subject. Martin's mother became an outspoken advocate for victims' rights in England, and was dejected when Mary Bell obtained anonymity backed by the authorities. Still, she supported the idea of giving her daughter anonymity, because she knew that she was not guilty of the crimes committed by her mother. She also worked with the National Association of Victims and of Mothers Against Murder and Assault to provide support to families who had lost a loved one. She died in 2013 due to cancer. Making the testimonies of the affected relatives visible is essential for us to understand the magnitude and significance of this type of case, the common mark on a society, and to avoid falling into sensationalism or classifying it as a simple striking police incident. Such shocking crimes, like those committed by Mary Bell, who was both victim and executioner, sometimes they make us forget that other victims also have a first and last name, and who are part of the history. Perhaps the value of Cries Unheard is the attempt to unravel the whys of violent behavior, which is becoming an alarmingly common occurrence. In some ways, Mary Bell is an anomaly. She strangled her victims with her hands instead of the now alarmingly typical shooting spree. Whether Mary's story can prevent the abuse of other children remains to be seen. It is an extraordinary cautionary tale of a child's capacity for violence. If it is true that children are blessed with intrinsic goodness, it can also be a very fragile blessing.